We continue our series of conversations with the 17 candidates on the ballot for Denver mayor. And returning here today is Dr. Lisa Calderón. Welcome back.
Thank you, Kyle. Great to be back.
So your campaign is based on the idea of not just changing Denver, but transforming Denver. What is the difference?
So it's just not changing the seats because a lot of the candidates who are considered top tier are backed by the same political infrastructure as before. So transforming is really about sharing power with the city council and with neighborhoods. As you know, we have a strong mayoral system of government, and that harkens back to the Klan years. What if we did it differently? What if we actually asked residents of Denver, hey, let's get your input on the budget right after the last budget was approved, go through a process rather than waiting to the end of the budget when the mayor has already fixed their idea on what it should be. So it really is a lot more community input built into the process.
And you believe that this will deliver different outcomes?
I'm counting on it because what has been done, especially for the past 12 years, hasn't worked. We see that, you know, we have these critical issues. Homelessness is one of them. I was one of the people who was saying long ago, with the camping ban was implemented, it's not going to work. It's going to make homelessness worse. It's not evidence-based. So as the mayor who has actually worked in services, we are going to do things that actually do work, that's supported by science. Imagine that.
When you talk about the idea of how this city could be changed, do you think that your ideas are radical? Do you embrace that term? Do you think that term is pejorative? What do you think about that word?
I think some people would say radical is pejorative. I don't, because it means the root of, right? We're going to go to the root causes, and that really is a foundation of my campaign. You know, when we focus on the unhoused folks, the visible homelessness, we are not looking at the root causes of what got people there. So if that's radical, looking at the root, then that's what we are going to do. But I also think that Denver has gotten much more progressive. Like, I'm a fourth generation Denverite, and we are the most progressive we've ever been as a city. So I think Denverites actually want those conversations to talk about root causes.
So I want to get into some specific issues in a second, but I feel like we're kind of up here, and I want to stay up here for a second to talk about this idea. So you'll hear other candidates in the race warn that Denver is going the way of a San Francisco or Portland or a Seattle. From where you sit, do you see those as examples of failed progressive governance? What do you see in San Francisco, Seattle, Portland?
Well, I love those cities. And I visit those cities, and I think that those are things we can learn from those cities. So, for example, Seattle recently passed a social housing ordinance, and that is a, part of my housing plan is to look at, we can't build fast enough. We also can't just do temporary solutions. We have to look at really changing infrastructures. I'm a criminal justice professor, and really looking at our history in terms of what does transformation take, and it really means we're not just changing the seats, we are changing the systems. And so that's what I would do.
One last big picture question. Former Mayor Wellington Webb was telling me that when you become mayor, everybody's your friend. Mm-hmm. If you're elected mayor, what would change with the developers, the law firms, the lobbyists who have had significant influence for administration after administration?
I would not be meeting with lobbyists, at least for the first 6 months. I know, having worked in city government, that is true. They're knocking on your door. They know how to get on your schedule. They even offer you free trips. And that is not something that I would accept as mayor. So I believe that there needs to be a clear line, especially with corporate lobbyists who have had access to the mayor's office. I want to set a different tone, and so I would start with the workers and residents.
So that was the lobbyists. How about the developers and the law firms?
Well, if they have lobbyists too, Kyle.
Fair enough.
And so I'm not interested in that. I mean, we have a demoralized workforce in the city, and so that is my really first priority, is hearing from them. They know the solutions in the city. I mean, this is a thing that bothers me with candidates. Like, we know everything. And the truth is, the solutions are already there with our city workforce and also there within our community, and that's who I want to hear from.
Let's talk about some specific issues. You said that the path to combating homelessness begins with ending the sweeps. Mm-hmm. For some folks, that's counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. Well, if you take away the sweeps, then the problem's going to get worse. We're going to see more encampments. Why would we not see more encampments under your plan?
I understand why people would feel that way because that has been the drumbeat for the past 12 years and even before. I've been a 20-year service provider. First 12 years working with victims of domestic violence as a legal director and victim advocate, and then also 8 years running the city's reentry program. That was co-created with community. And we have never tried an evidence-based strategy for ending homelessness. People need to understand that homelessness is solvable, and it starts with homes, it starts with resources. So that's why I would end the sweeps, but replace it with street crisis intervention responders. So these are folks who are going to assess the need and where folks need to go. There was a recent survey, 94% of folks want housing who are on the street and would go. And I've worked with those folks. I've also worked with folks who are resistant to going. And the key is understanding why they are resistant. And so that's not a one-size-fits-all, and I know that that's hard for people to get their heads around, but we can do that.
So some other smaller communities that have had great success in essentially ending homelessness in their communities have done almost a personalized approach, the by-name approach of knowing the people on the streets, figuring out what their needs are. Is Denver too big to do something like that? Could an approach like that work that's very tailored to the individual?
We are absolutely not too big, and that's also an evidence-based practice. So I've done it. I've done it on the street. It starts with the question of what happened to you, right? And so we need to know people's particular circumstances. Not until Host was created, which, by the way, was one of my ideas when I ran in 2019, that we really needed to consolidate our housing services because they were scattered all across the city. But it wasn't until then that service providers actually were coordinated. And so we need to scale that up. But absolutely, we can take an individualized approach because that's what service providers are already doing. But you can't do that when you're scattering people across the city.
So you'll hear a number of candidates in this race, about a half dozen of them say that with the folks on the street who are truly service resistant, that if it comes to it, they will arrest them for doing nothing more than violating the urban camping ban. Several have said, well, yes, they'll go to jail, but they can get services there, and that'll be the first step in their recovery or their transition out of homelessness. You said you don't believe that would work.
Absolutely not, and they don't know what they're talking about. They haven't been service providers. They haven't been working with this population for 20 years like I have, because if you're leaving domestic violence and have nowhere to go, you are homeless. If you are leaving the jail and you have no place to go, you are homeless. So I even take issue with the term service resistant. I mean, you have to start as a provider to be curious about why someone doesn't want to go into a shelter. And we know why. There's lots of reasons why people don't want to go into a shelter. Denver has been a shelter-first model, not a housing-first model. We pretend like we're housing-first, but we're not. And so instead, what we do is say, well, if you're really good, you can earn your way up to housing. Shelter or housing first flips that and says, we're going to give you housing first, and then we'll figure out all of these other needs. But first, it starts with stabilization through housing.
So one critique of that you'll hear is that it takes too long to scale up the housing. So we have to get people into transitional shelter first and not into housing. How do you address that?
It takes longer to criminalize people because you're working them through the system and they're coming back through the system, and it's more expensive. So, I get it, teaching, law and policy is that historically, the criminal legal system has been the quick fix, so that's why there's calls for more police. And we need to really help people to understand that there really is a more effective way, and prevention is a way to do that. So
your approach to this, if it hasn't already been described like this, I'm sure somebody has said that it's a soft on the issue approach, or that it's not hard line enough, or whatever else. What is your thought about just the state of the encampments in the city? Is it an unacceptable situation for you? Because a lot of candidates have taken this approach that it's a problem that must be solved. You're talking about helping the folks who actually live there. Understand that. We've talked about that. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about just the general state of encampments around the city?
Well, I used to be unhoused as a teen, escaping domestic violence from my home. And so it's unacceptable, but not just for me, but for the people who are unhoused. So again, you talk to them and they're telling you they want housing. My homelessness and housing plan, which is on my website, lisafordenver.com, was co-created with people with that lived experience and public health experts. And what they've told us is that, you know what, give us a place where we want to go to, not places that we are forced to go to. So when I hear crazy ideas from candidates, like we're going to round them all up and put them out at DIA, or we're going to involuntarily commit them, so somehow you don't have human rights or constitutional rights anymore, that is so problematic. So I don't ever give up on human beings. And I don't want our city to give up on human beings either. So I'd like us to see it from their perspective rather than people who feel more entitled sometimes than unhoused people. I am those people because I've lived it.
What's your general opinion of the Denver Police Department?
I think that we are beyond reform and we are beyond training. 2 years past the murder of George Floyd and the $14 million jury verdict for the protesters, we can't keep talking about training. We can't keep talking about reform. We have to really talk about reimagining what public safety looks like. And it isn't just the police, it's our whole public safety system. I have a real problem with one person, the public safety manager, and take your pick, there's been revolving doors through the years, who operate in a way that is not transparent. They have a lot of power and very little oversight. You can't file a complaint against the public safety manager, for example. They just report to the mayor, essentially. So I would like a commission to really oversee and restructure our public safety department to give more community input and transparency into how our public safety system works.
How about an elected sheriff?
I have supported an elected sheriff. I've even participated in writing a draft of it, and the Hancock administration made sure that that initiative got killed. When I talk about decentralizing government, that's part of it. I want the public to have input on who their sheriff is. The police chief also. I like Chief Thomas. He's worked well with community. He's come from community. But the public didn't choose him as their chief. And I have been one of the community people who wanted to make sure community was at the table with the choosing of our public safety leaders, and that hasn't happened consistently. So I want to institutionalize a process for community for those seats.
Can you be as specific as possible when you talk about reimagining policing? What is it that DPD does now that you want them to stop doing, and what is it that you would like them to start doing?
Sure. So there is 112 recommendations on the reimagining policing and public safety task force that I was part of creating and editing. So we're really talking about less reliance on the police. So having police sweep people would not be a function I would have our police force do. And quite frankly, I've been training law enforcement for 20 years. They don't want to do it either. So let's shift the focus for the police on actually solving crimes, intervening in crimes, rather than picking on poor people.
So that's one function. What are some other ones?
Just the way our criminal legal system works and engages with the public. There's the misnomer out there that more police equals more safety. And there's lots of studies that show that that is not true. But we also know what does keep people safe. So when my son was assaulted at 15 years old, walking home from school from East High School, I couldn't get anyone to listen to me when he was assaulted by the police. And that did not increase safety. And this was around the time of broken windows policing, which was an aggressive form of policing. I could not get our officials to listen to me, but our neighbors organized, and we asked the question of each other, what do you need to make yourself safe? And really it was about community efficacy, so empowerment of the community. They wanted to know how to de-escalate situations. So if their neighbor's dog was barking, instead of calling the cops, what could we be doing better? COVID really isolated us from each other, and I plan to create an Office of Community Engagement, so we're actually talking to each other again, but also giving each other the resources to problem solve in our neighborhoods.
Would you reduce the number of authorized officers for DPD?
I'm not looking at reducing. What I am looking at is reinvesting. So for example, You know, we have, again, the street enforcement team. They're not cops, but they're cops light, so they can give out tickets. But if we instead shift the function from like sweeps from the officers to service providers, that is a shift of the budget and of training. So, you know, I want to have that conversation with communities rather than me as mayor just saying, this is the way it's going to be.
There are some cities that have said that one way to reimagine policing would be to get police out of the business of doing traffic stops, because it's often not physically dangerous situations in which you insert somebody with a gun. What do you think about that idea?
I agree. I mean, the number one risk factor for police killings is interaction with the police, particularly for people of color. And so we all know now, we're all familiar with traffic stops that turn terribly wrong. And, you know, I have been part of, you know, creating projects to track those numbers. But yeah, if we can stop though, you know, really look at administrative functions more or less where we don't need an officer, then let's do that.
Let's talk about the issue of affordable housing more generally. You're the only candidate in the race that I've heard talking about a master leasing program. And I had to look this up because I didn't know what it was. But basically to explain to folks who have never heard about it as well, it's the idea that a public agency or service provider would lease units from a landlord, and then they would sublease those out to people who are getting out of homelessness or escaping domestic violence situations, things like that. Why use that approach, and how much would that cost?
So again, it's in my plan. People can look it up. So first, I believe in using every tool in the toolbox. So I support safe outdoor spaces. I support safe to park, tiny homes, all of that. But we need to understand those are temporary. And instead, master leasing can get people into permanent housing, and it also doesn't concentrate poverty in one area. So we're doing this around the city. What the price tag would be, I don't know yet, but I know it is very, and part of the reason I don't know is because we also cannot get a number on how much the sweeps have cost us. And I don't mean just what we see on that day. I also mean the Department of Transportation has a role, and the police department has a role, and private contractors have a role. So let's figure out how much we're spending on that, and this administration has been very resistant to those costs.
How do we do a better job of getting affordable housing built at different price points?
So this is where social housing comes in, and what it means is housing for people at different incomes. So even up to 120% AMI, area median income, which we know is actually going up every year, right? So that's not a great way to measure affordability, but in a social housing structure, you could be making, so I was a single parent at one point on public assistance, and I wouldn't pay more than 30% of that income. If I'm doing better, I get a job and I can pay more, still 30% of whatever income I'm making. If I lose my job, then I also don't pay more than 30%. The folks at the top tier are helping to subsidize those who need more help on the bottom income level. That means when you lose a job, you don't lose your housing. And that's a system that we're in now. And so that's why I'm in support of rent stabilization, whether it be rent control, which actually means rent regulation, right? It should be predictable how much your rent goes up. And that's what I'm talking about. We need every tool in the toolbox.
So when you talk about social housing, here again, for folks who are not super familiar with it, this is the idea that the city is kind of acting as a pseudo-developer, like getting into the business of developing housing without having the profit motive or burden that developers have to make money off of things. Right. There aren't many cities that appear to have made that work. In Seattle, they just passed it, but they don't have funding for it yet. It's just an idea. How do you make that actually work?
Well, it first starts with the will to do it. I mean, we have to start with a vision. What we have now, this incremental, few units here, few units there, and if you financially qualify, then you can have it. We need something bigger and broader, and all working at the same time. Because what we have so far, relying on the market, has not worked for poor people and struggling families in this city. Can
you do what you want to do as mayor without increased revenues by way of new taxation?
I think we have to be very particular about what kind of taxation. And I recognized you asked that question on the debate stage about that, and we didn't get to qualify it or to explain. We know that lower income folks are paying more than their share of taxes than wealthier folks. We need to look at how do we right size that. I think, when we look at property taxes, for example, and those keep going up, and I know I got my tax bill and it's pretty eye-opening. There are also people who will be made homeless because even if their house is paid off, their taxes have gone up. So what are we doing to help subsidize those people to stay in their homes? So I want to look at subsidies. When I talk about affordable housing, I am talking about subsidies. We have to do more than just look at housing that is on the street. We also have to look at what is invisible, and those are people who are struggling just to stay in their homes.
So if property tax is squeezing people at the margins, and Denverites have piled on sales tax on top of sales tax on top of sales tax, which we know is a regressive tax, then you're left with income tax. There are a couple of cities that have city-based income taxes, like similar to New York cities. Is that something that Denver should consider?
I know, so I'm not opposed to taxes. I'm a good Democrat, been a lifelong Democrat, know that they pay for a lot of great things. But I also know that in an increasingly unaffordable city, that we have to figure out a way that we aren't squeezing the working class people, the elders on fixed incomes. There needs to be a balance, and right now we don't have that. And as mayor, I'd want to talk to a lot of smart tax people about how do we right-size that.
Let's finish up on the idea of cars. You said that you want our transportation infrastructure to de-emphasize cars. How do you de-emphasize cars in a city that was in part built post-World War II for the automobile?
Well, there's lots of plans upon plans, and so why don't we implement them? I would want to work with the auditor to figure out where are we in all of our transportation plans. I support, for example, the VAMOS network, which means interconnected high comfort bike lanes. I would like to ask the public which streets, if any, should we be closing to just bikes? I would love to see that. But I also believe in community engagement process, and that's why I would open an Office of Community Engagement, because planner skills are different than engagement skills. I want to have essentially that office be in lots of different places where people naturally congregate, like rec centers and libraries, the one-stop shopping, but that also includes getting the public's input. We have to be less car dependent. Our environment demands it, and people want more multimodal options, and I'm all for it. But I also believe in having communities have their say, and we can both have robust community engagement and also accelerate plans that have been sitting on the shelves for years.
When you talk about taking power out of the office of mayor and giving more power to community groups, does that necessitate that Calderón administration would be less predictable? Because we're not just relying on your promises. No, you're saying, we'll let these folks decide this, and these folks decide this, and these folks decide this. People are voting for somebody without knowing necessarily what the outcomes or the goals are going to be.
You know, I have a lot of faith and trust in Denver voters. I have been an organizer since I was a kid. And I know that people, again, understand the solutions for their communities. But it also needs to be highly coordinated. And so I would want people in my administration who know how to work in community, who aren't intimidated, afraid, or feel like that they have to wrangle people into what the city wants to do. I think Park Hill Golf Course is one of those, right? The city had a predetermined outcome, and then it had community engagement meetings, and then pretended like this is what the public wanted all along. People are tired of those kind of processes. So again, I have a lot of faith in Denver residents.
If I recall, they threw you off the advisory board.
They did, and you were one of the people who highlighted that, so thank you.
We're ending each of these interviews with a question about the horse race, just kind of about the competition out there. And you seem, shall I say, less than impressed by some of the other front runners in the race. Do you see Kelly Brough, Chris Hansen, Debbie Ortega, Mike Johnson, do you see them as essentially status quo candidates that would just kind of keep everything in Denver the same? Do you see them as a marginal improvement over the Hancock administration, of which you've been so critical, or do you think they'd make things worse?
I absolutely see them as part of the establishment. I mean, Kelly Brough makes a big deal about, I've never run for office before, but she's never left politics. She has been behind the scenes, helping to pull the strings of this city. And that's why I talk about I want to repair the harm for workers that was done under the Hickenlooper and Hancock administrations, gutting worker pay and benefits and having to wait longer to retire. For Johnston, you know, he kind of comes in riding on his silver horse, and yet he also impacted workers with his bill 191 that tied teacher performance to test scores, and that accelerated the pushing out of black and brown teachers. So, you know, it's different faces, but it's the same political machine. And, you know, that's why I have no problem, you know, speaking truth to power with candidates like those.
Lisa Calderón, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Kyle. Thank you.